Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. As always, I have a DM Advice episode prepared for today, and as promised, it's all about a few very general world building tips, more specifically 5 world building tips, as you can probably tell from the title, and how they relate to D&D and DMing. So without anything else, let's learn something. My first point kind of goes back to last week's 2 DM Advice episodes and what they were all about. Real quick, they were also about world building. And if you haven't seen them, I'll put a link down below and a card up above if you're interested. But on with the point, this one is build the world to the story and not the story to the world. That's what my episodes last week were kind of about and kind of getting to. And I want to say first, I get it. It may seem beneficial to get all of your pieces for the world together at one place before using them to build what happens in the story, but it isn't that simple. You see, if you build the world first, you're essentially going in blindly. You have no idea what your story might require. You might get lucky and you might have everything you need outright, but chances are you'll end up actually using and needing very little of what you actually make. On the other hand, if you write what you'll need for the story first, or at least start with the story first, then you'll know exactly what you need and be able to build from there. Doing it this way saves you a lot of unnecessary struggle and even allows your world to be a little bit more easily readable for your players when they're traversing the campaign that you build for them. Now, I want to say real quick that if you aren't writing a story or running a campaign, and if you're just world building for the world and for the sake of the fun of doing it, then go for it. Just make the world. But if you want to run a campaign, I recommend at least coming up with a concept for the story first before you even begin thinking about building the world. It'll help to know which directions are best for you to build in if you do it this way. It will save you time by allowing you to build in those directions, so you're minimizing the unnecessary things you make, and even save you from a lot of unnecessary headaches and discouragement later on when you start realizing you don't have everything that you might think you needed. To get a feel for what I mean by that last part when I say it'll help you not get discouraged, just ask yourself if you've ever gotten discouraged when writing a story before. Did you try to build the world first? I find that doing this locks you into a box, so to speak, since there are now much fewer ways that your story can progress. You also, as I hinted at earlier at the beginning of this point, probably built a lot of, well, probably very cool and really awesome stuff, in all likelihood entirely unnecessary things for the story that you're trying to tell. In a way, you're trying to fit the story to fit the world rather than the world to fit the story. And if you're running for a D&D campaign or running a story, chances are you're trying to tell a story, not just present a world to your players. Most writers and DMs actually end up accidentally creating unnecessary characters and settings and the like anyway, and then once you're done, you have to go through and combine certain characters to lead other characters, make certain scenes happen in different locations, and like I said, even writers do this. This applies even to a story that you're writing in which you actually have complete control over everything. Things are obviously much more complicated in this area when it comes to a campaign, because as I always say, these things tend to meander and that's normal and it's a headache, but it happens. But what you're doing when you start building the world first is you're starting out already with characters who are likely unnecessary, settings that probably won't come into play, etc. And you're setting yourself up for the kinds of headaches that I just mentioned before you even begin writing the story. It'll be even harder to tell which of the elements of the story are relevant and which ones are unnecessary because you're not even sure what the story holds yet. But once you do know what the story holds and what you'll need, even if on a very basic level, because you won't have it all on your first go, then you have my permission to really start rolling your sleeves up and building the world. My next tip actually gets right on with that as well, and it's make everything that you build unique in some way. Now first, when I say unique, I don't just mean different, I mean make everything special in some way, shape, or form. This is a fantasy world, remember, and if you're building an entire setting for your campaign, it's best to make things stand out a little bit. If you're building cities, maybe one is the largest, and it ends up being this sprawling fantasy metropolis. If you're building a dwarven city underground, maybe it's not just in some cave, maybe it's in the deepest fissure of a continent that was caused by a massive earthquake that took out a city that was once there so long ago. And the same goes for your NPCs. You might not see making NPCs as world building, but it still kind of is. Maybe not to the same degree, but I still highly recommend making them special in some way. Maybe the shopkeeper houses some deep mysterious secret. Maybe the party's patron used to be a well-known fighter, but now hides it after some scandal and, unknown to the players, is actually really good in a fight. Obviously, what you do and build for these things depends on your story and what's happening in the campaign, and the story can give you some pretty good inspiration and direction for this kind of stuff as well, like I said in my first point and in last week's episodes. But building like this can also, in turn, give you some pretty good story ideas going forward. It also helps make your world interesting and engaging for your players, and helps gives you a lot of unique locations and NPCs, etc. that have a reason for existing and push the plot forward in interesting, unique ways. But even that isn't enough. Everything can be cool and all, but if it's all the same, it can get really old really fast. And that's my next point. Make your world a diverse place. It can be really easy to just fall into the same patterns, but keep an eye out for this. It's also pretty easy to catch yourself doing, so just make sure things aren't the same everywhere, and it really is that simple. That really is all there is to it. For example, if your players keep coming across dude after dude after dude, maybe mix up some other genders in there as well. Also, your story takes place in a fantasy world with all kinds of different fantasy people. You have orcs, dwarves, even people who descended from fiends and celestial beings. There's no reason why your campaign shouldn't have NPCs of all shapes, sizes, genders, walks of life, etc. And the reason why I started with NPCs is because your players are probably going to be interacting with them a lot, and having the same ones or ones that are practically the same over and over again, just with a different name, can get pretty boring. But it can also get pretty confusing. You don't want your players mixing up their patron with the evil boss, for example. Listen, these things can get pretty confusing as it is sometimes, and there might be a lot of NPCs to keep up with as it is, so don't make that any harder on your players than it already is. It also just isn't realistic. When you step out into the real world, you're going to see all types of people. So when your players step out of that tavern, they should see all different types of people as well, perhaps even more so than in the real world, because there are just so many more kinds of people who inhabit these kinds of fantasy worlds. And I realize that yes, while realism isn't necessarily your goal in a fantasy setting, that applies to the fact that the world probably has magic and dragons and all other kinds of fantasy-like beings living in it, not the fact that there are people with whom your players are going to be talking and interacting with. That idea doesn't apply here. Put all kinds of people in your campaigns. But we're not just talking about NPCs. If every quest you send your players on takes place in a sewer or ends up in the same boss fight over and over again, or even if they're all on the same type of quest with the same format over and over again, the same idea still applies. This will get really boring really fast. Now, obviously, if your entire campaign takes place in one location or in just one big setting, or it's just one big quest, that's fine, but you should still have varied encounters in diverse locations in that one place. For example, if you have your players in a sewer and the entire campaign takes place in a sewer, there are still many locations you can have. There's obviously the sewer main. There are very likely different channels. You might have some monster's lair deep underwater. You might have a cave network and a river attached to the sewer, maybe some criminal syndicate or evil cult is held up in there somewhere, and the list just goes on depending on your story, of course. And just like with NPCs, there is no excuse to not have a diverse world in terms of settings and quests, etc. And besides that, this also allows you to make those encounters even more interesting. You want your players to be engaged, make things diverse. If you throw the same similar encounter or encounters and such at your players over and over and over again, they're probably just going to learn how to circumnavigate them, and they'll just get through them super easily every single time, and it probably won't be that fun for them anymore. Vary your obstacles and make your players think. But as you might have guessed, making all of your things that you build in your world different from each other requires a little bit of extra knowledge. So my next point is all about that: research. I know, again, it's a fantasy world, but you still need to do a little bit of research. If you want your players to come across a bank, maybe look into how banks worked during the Middle Ages. If you want to run some cutthroat political intrigue game, then you'd better look up whatever kinds of politics you're employing and how they work. This helps the story move forward in a realistic manner, it helps the world react in realistic ways, and it helps you keep a clear idea of what's happening moving forward. For example, if your players break into a noble's house, you might think it could be smart for the noble to react in a certain way, but maybe there's a much smarter solution and a much more interesting solution that you'll find if only you do a little bit of research. Now, I'm not saying that everything needs to be super realistic. If there's an alternative that maybe isn't quite as realistic, but is very cool and helps things move along, or just keeps your players from dying, then I say go for it. And if your players have a problem with that, remind them that this is a game and not a prize-winning novel. But my next point is something that your players won't have a problem with at all, and that's bring your world to life. You can build the most amazing world that anyone has ever seen, but if nothing is going on in it, well, it simply doesn't matter how good it is. It'll just be a very pretty ghost town, which actually sounds like the name of a novel, so if there are any writers listening to this, feel free to steal that and write that novel. I want to read it. But anyway, getting back on track, if your players go anywhere, which I hope they do, there should be things happening. Is there a new merchant in town or a circus coming into town? The town tavern would probably be bustling with activity and rumors of people talking about it in anticipation. Maybe there's a wizard's tower off in the distance that no one messes with, bonus points if whatever you add is related to the story. I'll add in a little bonus tip here, and that is that it helps to know what's going on in the background. This helps you know when and where to include these living parts of your world. Now, I'm not saying that every single place that your party goes to has to have this huge bustling network of activity. Just try to make sure that in most places there are things going on they can learn from and that they can do, at least if they decide to. But that's it for this week's DM Advice episode. Come back next week for a video all about new DM mistakes and what can be done to avoid them, and for an interesting tale of player creativity. Of course, thanks for watching, and I hope this helped. Until next time, let's learn something.